Hello, I'm artist Jillian Knipe, creator of Art Fictions, which explores the stories of art and the art of stories. My guest today is the abstract painter, Ms. Katie Pratt, who has selected a fictional book for us both to read and kickstart our conversation. We'll be winding our way through the text, its characters and ideas, then eventually arriving at what's going on in Katie's studio. Welcome to Art Fictions, Katie.
Nice to be here, Jillian.
For our discussion today, you've chosen the novel Once in Europa by John Berger, which we were just discussing. I have bought, it's actually an ex-library book, which I bought from World of Books, second-hand.
The best.
The best. By way of introduction, John Berger also wrote Ways of Seeing, which was based on his television series, which aired in the 70s, of the same name. In this, he challenged the traditional art criticism by focusing on how we look at paintings in order to make a more meaningful evaluation. He also wrote very widely, and Katie's read a lot more than me. I have read A Painter of Our Time, though, which Rosalind Davis, who was my first guest ever on the podcast a few years ago, she chose that. So I am somewhat familiar with John Berger, although he's quite a British character, isn't he?
Well, except that he lived in France. He was British, but he was an expat.
Yes. And we will talk a little bit more about why he moved to France. So, Once in Europa is the second book in the Into Their Labours trilogy, which traces the journey of the European peasant from the mountains to the metropolis. So, in other words, you know it's going to end badly, from moving from one state of poverty to another. It's a collection of interwoven short stories in which a traditional alpine village collides with the future-driven urban culture. Katie Pratt, why did you choose this book?
Well, I chose it because in my mind I thought it was important to have a writer that I'd binged on, and because I wanted it to connect to my practice obliquely, but not directly. And I thought it was very timely because the day that we're recording today, the 1st of February, most big unions in the UK are on strike.
Hurrah!
There's a big drive towards collectivity amongst workers in most of Berger's work. He believes in workers' rights, and this book has, am I allowed to say it has industrial accidents as part of the major feature of what happens in it, and also because it connects to my own sense of identity. So I suppose I read it for the first time maybe 10 years ago, and it was when the whole kind of we should have an in-out referendum debate was going crazy, and my family were émigrés from Central Europe, and this sense of borders being a recent and an artificial construct is something that was really prescient in my kind of consciousness at that time. So, you know, I feel like my centre of gravity is in Central Europe rather than in the UK, and if it is in the UK, it's in London and not in anywhere else within the UK.
So but you've read all the books, right, in the trilogy?
All the books in the trilogy, yeah.
Yeah.
I do find when you read I've read a lot of his books, but then a lot of these kind of essays, some of the books are more kind of have more of a kind of essay form than a kind of fiction form, and you do end up reading the same chapter twice in different books. So I cut down and started reading other stuff after a while. Yeah.
I found this is the thing with John Berger. I find his writing a little bit clunky. You know, he'll be writing in a very descriptive, you know, this happened, then that happened way, and I think, oh, it's a bit dull. And then he'll turn it around and there'll be some complete gem. I mean, So part of the clunkiness for me is his overuse of the word buxom
Yes.
to describe the women. There's a few outdated
It was the same
things.
woman that he kept using that word for,
Oh,
though.
okay.
But yes, point taken.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And also, as I've said to you before, I think that he's a product of his time and culture, and I also think that his work generally is really kind of heterocentric, and it's very Eurocentric as well. But then, he was predominantly writing in a time before international travel was, global travel was very accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And he, just as he wrote A Painter of Our Time, he was a writer of his time, but it is somewhat appropriate that your copy of the novel has a bum on it.
Yeah.
But then he turns around and there is a poem about...
It's not just a bum, it's a lady bum.
Oh, it's a lady bum, that's right. It's a beautiful lady bum, I will say. Whereas I've got a very serious book cover with a map. He does write a beautiful poem in the beginning called The Leather of Love, which I'm just going to read. Weathered as gateposts by departures and the white ghosts of the gone, wrapped in tarpaulins we talk of passion. Our passion's the saline in which hides are hung to make from a hinge of skin the leather of love. So this is not the person in a way that is, discussing or describing those awkward love scenes or anything like that. It's very different. And he does write about, there's one of the characters, Boris, and he says, it was as if at the moment of his conception every one of his cells had been instructed to grow large, but his spine, femur, tibia, fibula had played truant, which is such a great description. As a result, he was of average height, but his features and extremities were like those of a giant. So he's and then all of a sudden he's incredibly eloquent, which I find quite funny.
I find him very humanist as well, that he's got a great sensitivity for how humans connect, but also, the human condition, the transience of life, and and in animals as well. He's written a lot about animals as well as humans in this book, but he's even written a book about animals. It's how to look at animals or something like that. And I'm not so sure about his poetry. I don't know whether I've got the kind of context to gauge it. I know that his drawing is not great. He's a great one of a sort of wet finger and smudgy wet finger. So I think that he has a kind of insight which he is very deft at articulating into what it feels like to have a selfhood, whether it's a human selfhood or a bovine selfhood, or he does. I find it a bit presumptuous when he talks about how women think and how women feel, but I suppose if I were, some people say I am a cow, but
not me.
It's not what it's like to be a cow at all.
Well, speaking of that sort of that empathy, insight, respect that he has, he didn't just theorise, did he? In fact, it was really important to him to not be living life as a theory in the same context that Karl Marx wanted philosophy to become a reality. Because John Berger, of course, moved to France for, what was it? And lived on a farm, worked on a farm for 10 years or something?
I don't know, but I know he lived and died in France.
Yeah.
I know that he was British and he moved, and that he lived in this particular part of the Alps, I think, where France borders Italy. It's certainly where this trilogy is set. And I think he died in Paris, as far as I know.
Yeah,
Lived
yeah.
and died in Paris.
I mean, as a result, he needed to, in a way, be able to balance that notion of his opinion, his leanings towards communism. I mean, he mentions the Communist Party newspaper several times through the book.
Only in respect of one character, I think. Oh no, maybe that's not true.
I think he referred to it at the very beginning and at the very end,
There
because
are 3 different chapters,
yeah.
3 different kind of vignettes that
yeah.
talk about. One talks about the newspaper, one talks about a Communist Party meeting, and another one talks about a guy who is a communist.
Yes, yes. See, you read that 10 years ago. You said, "Oh, I'm not
I
sure
read it
if I
again
remember."
yesterday. I read it again yesterday.
You can remember it better than I can.
Well, yeah, like I said, I read it yesterday.
So there's that sort of opinion, but there's also the story. He creates a story, and so there's that lived experience, and also, I mean, I would say it's an alternative to academic writing. You know, he's extremely informed, but he wants the writing and his television show, for the fact that he did a television show that appeared on the BBC, he wants to be accessible.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to be a theorist up in the clouds.
Yeah, and also I think that TV series was a response to Clark. Is it Robert Clark or TJ? Robert Clark, TJ.
Mr. Clark?
No, well, they're both writers. The Art Historian with Bad Teeth,
Right.
1960s guy. It was
Okay.
kind of a rebuttal. It was a challenge to some of his issues.
So what was Clark's...
Well, he was very
what was
kind
the
of-
challenge?
Well, I'm no art historian, so I've seen both series, and I've read both their work, but I think the problem with Clark was, again, it was a product of its time, and it very much didn't kind of challenge, all artists were men and they were all European, as opposed to maybe inquiring into whether it was just those of the artists that got the exposure and the provenance rather than those of the makers, and why people don't make artwork when they're on the margins of hunger, on the breadline. I wanted to say, when you were talking about how he didn't want to kind of be a theorist so much, but he wanted to live his work, I wanted to say that in the introduction you use the word peasant, and it does crop up quite a lot in the book, and that's a kind of word that we now would find really derogatory, and it's the kind of thing that you can use as an insider, and I think also that by living in the community and living your politics is the best way of preaching, rather than kind of telling everyone else how they should live. And I think that's one of the messages you kind of get from Berger, that, and not everything goes as planned. You can set up a set of structures, social structures, and make contingencies, but it doesn't mean that they're going to go your way.
Yeah, I mean, are we talking about John Berger now, or are we talking about an art practice?
Well, both. Well, that's one reason why I picked it, because that's how I think about art practice. But yeah, I was talking about Berger.
Yeah.
And how very many of the characters just get bad luck. That they play by a set of rules, or they break the rules, and things don't come out in expected ways. But that is how life is. Some people get break after break, and other people set themselves up to succeed, and other people set themselves up to fail, but some people set themselves up to succeed and still fail, and vice versa. Yeah.
Although, that's part of what he's describing in terms of the village life is, he brings it to the ideas around love and loss, and there's a lot of love and loss. In fact, there's a lot of sadness throughout, because he depicts these characters. For instance, I can't remember the name of the guy in the first story. I think it's Philippe. And Felix. And Felix is lives with his mother, and he's not married, and he has no prospects. Oh, it's Philippe is I think the cheesemaker who's gonna about to be married, and and then his mum dies, and then he just has no one, and at the end, and it's really sad. There's a lot of that goes on through the book.
When he's running a farm single-handedly, he has even less time because he has to do more work.
Yeah, that's right. So there's no prospect of any kind of girlfriend or relationship, and there seems to be quite a lot of isolation of these characters.
Well, actually, that chapter does have a slightly optimistic end, because he gets out his accordion, plays it in the farm, and then people come to him.
That's true, although it's quite funny. It's really sweet, because his dad says to him, it's time you got a rifle and learnt how to shoot. Yes. He says, actually, I'd rather have an accordion, which is brilliant.
Well, and his dad went with it.
Yeah, and it worked out for him in the end. Actually, speaking of that story, that also depicts, I think, a great thing that Berger does, which is he's not living in some sort of wafty, idealistic zone. He's, for instance, he's back onto Felix when he's playing his accordion during the wedding procession. He says, each woman had removed her stole, and the white linen, undulating in the wind, caressed the bare shoulders of the woman behind her. A mist covered the hills. A cowshat, when he ceased playing, a pungent smell of wild garlic wafted towards him. So,
is this a scene that's a hallucination or a scene that's an actual? Because when they talk about gypsies coming, those are metaphorical gypsies, not metaphorical. They're kind of imagined gypsies rather than real gypsies.
No, I think this was during the procession, which sort of got more, the wedding procession, which got more and more weird, I think.
Yeah.
But there was another one with Danielle and Pasquale, and where they're having an intimate moment of discourse. She even told him about the crocuses. When she had finished, there was silence. They heard a cow pissing in the stable, separated from the kitchen by a wall of pine boards. So there's all this sort of matter-of-factness. In fact, Felix's mother dies, Albertine, and she's got everything organised. What she's going to wear. She doesn't want people coming and being sympathetic towards her. It's a very grounded, down-to-earth, lack of idealistic.
When I was in primary school, we went to France on a coach for, I think it was an overnight, a short trip, staying in a youth hostel, and this was like the end of primary school, obviously. And I remember, it was like late 70s, but I looked out of the coach window, and there was a woman carrying milk churns like 50 miles away from Kent. And I could not believe my eyes.
Wow.
Because even in primary school, you learned about milk going in tankers and, electronic milking systems. And I suppose part of what, this is actually set in the 1980s or 70s. Oh, some of it's set in the 50s, but it's spanning the second half of the 20th century. Part of what his point is, I think, is the abject poverty in rural areas that persisted and still persists. That there still are people who have kind of been technologically abandoned, and while there are the kind of shishi people living in the cities, living nice bourgeois, comfortable lifestyle, there's still people who have basically cows in their kitchen, and you're eating your cereal and you can smell cow piss. because a cow's pissing the other side of the not even substantial wall.
That does sound astonishing, though, you know, like a little Vermeer vignette out the bus window. But he does make that contrast, doesn't he, between village life and the urban life. I mean, there's the main story, Once in Europa, is one of the stories, one of the short stories. And in that, there's the factory.
Links, by the way,
Yeah.
because the characters crop up not only
Yeah.
across throughout this book, but also they're traced through the trilogy. And
Oh, really?
so the trilogy is this is the middle one, so it's also chronologically the middle one, and some of the characters get picked up in Lilac and Flag, and some of them come from. There are some references in there which are from Pig Earth.
Oh, okay. So are they? Is it a sequence in time in terms of the whole trilogy, or are they? Because this one you've got, say again, coming back to Once in Europa, you've got village life, and then you've got the factory that gets set up, and you've got the dad who's like, "There's no way I'm selling my land to the factory people."
Yeah, but Jean de Florette.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and it
Is it Florette? I got that right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it arguably kills him in the end.
Yeah.
He certainly dies well before his wife, and but yeah, he's actually there was a lovely one as well about the doctor, where it says he'd come straight to the village from medical school, full of idealism. Now, after 10 years, he was disillusioned. Mountain people did not listen to reason, he complained. Mountain people drank too much. Mountain people went on repeating what they thought they heard once when they were children. Mountain people never recognized a rational process. Mountain people behaved as if they thought that life itself was mad. So, you know, there's that sort of thing going on as well. There's actually another book. It's Life of a Shepherd or something like that. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it is a very recent book, and it is about life in the Lake District in the UK, where you have somebody who's, you know, part of generations and generations and generations of farming, and the teachers come into the school and say, hey, you've got to get an education and you've got to have hopes and possibilities, and they're sitting there, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's actually written by somebody who ended up going to Oxford and wrote this book, but he did go back to his farming life because he missed it so much. But is there anything that you felt about that sort of, you know, city urban?
I think that
tension?
Part of what the trilogy does is chart the slightly late industrialisation of the rural margins of the Alps and similar European areas, the coming of the Industrial Revolution to these parts. And of course you still need rural areas to feed the population. Well, you still need farming to feed the population, but because the first one is completely rural and the last one is actually completely urbanised in the trilogy. So I think that that's partly what it's about.
And this one is more the transition, isn't it?
Yeah. And out of step with other parts of Europe, certainly. And the irony being it's called In Europa. But you would expect by 1985, say, Europe had become a kind of modern industrialised society. And I guess part of what the book is saying is not all of Europe.
So, sorry, are you talking about the UK being somewhat out of step, or?
Well, no, because the UK is a small place, and because the Industrial Revolution the UK was one of the first instigators of the industrial, or it started in the UK and other places, it was one of the places where it started, that's what I'm trying to say. So no, I'm not talking about the UK, I'm talking about In Europa, the book, that by the time this book is set, certainly the end of the book, you would imagine that most of Europe was pretty much industrialised. Certainly the farming was subject to industrial processes.
Yeah, I mean, they do talk about it in the book about the pollution and the sort of endless smoke from the factory, and that comes up a lot in paintings around the same time. Lowry paintings,
and also the lack of responsibility for industrial as health and safety and industrial relations. Exactly what we're seeing in the news at the moment about industrial relations being all the workers' fault. Coming from free marketeers, where you kind of go, well, they're withdrawing their labour. It's a market transaction. You're not paying them enough, so they're not working. You free marketeer capitalist people.
Yeah, I saw the film last night actually about Nan Goldin, and it was I think it's called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, and it was about the Sackler family and their name. Actually, probably they ought to go into anonymity, so probably you shouldn't even mention them. But, the connection with the opioid crisis, and, well, they started it really, but the fact that their name has now been taken off all the big institutions, from the Guggenheim to the Tate. I think the V&A was about the last one. But I did walk out of the cinema thinking, more strikes, more. And there are powers that be that want obviously less, or none at all.
Can I say one last thing about the book as
Absolutely.
well? I wanted to say that I identify with the mountains because it was where my mother's family originally came from. Not France, but Germany.
Oh, okay.
So I spent a lot of time in the Alps as a child, and it is very vivid to me anyway, this kind, not necessarily the communities, because my grandmother was born in Munich, like in the city, not in the cowshed. But a lot of the kind of the landscape, certainly, and the rural, gauging wealth by the amount of cow dung you have. That kind of thing is very familiar to me.
I don't want to go from shit to talking about your painting.
Oh, that's fair enough.
But
I think it's fair enough.
Well, we get it. Okay, that's a really low start. We're just going to elevate ourselves from there.
Well, it's very Berger-esque.
Yes. Keeping it real. So I would like to now talk a little bit more about your painting, or talk about your painting specifically. So, Katie, you're an abstract painter, mostly known for your large paintings, which feature dynamic colours and heavy volumes of paint. Your work is exhibited internationally, including the 2020 John Moores, and you won the Jerwood Painting Prize in 2001, the Thermae Bath Spa Commission as well. And both of us use organic and geometric details in our paintings, though we arrive at these through very different means, producing very different outcomes. And of course, you have been painting for about 30 years, and I've been painting for less than 10. So that'll be another difference.
Thanks for that, Jillian.
What's also apparent in your work is your complex diagrammatic systems, and it's it always seems to me like the system is derived from an organic source, but I don't know what that source is, or even if you think of it as a source. So maybe you describe it in your words.
Well, I could say how that book relates to my practice, and I suppose it starts with the phenomenon, the actual material of paint, that, you have to make the first gesture. And rather than get kind of tied up in indecision, it's like, let's just get on with it and chuck a big bucket of something at the surface, or just get it down quickly. And then you've got something to react to, and also something that you might respond quite strongly against. But when you were talking earlier about how about the relationship between theory and practice, essentially, in relation to Berger, and living your practice rather than theoritizing. To me, how I organise the surface of this kind of messy, gunky, hasty gesture is very relates to how I'm trying to think through how we could share the planet's resources with all the beings that need access to them, and how communities can organise, how we can, without damaging other life forms, whether it's plants or animals or other humans or whatever it is, ecosystems. And ecosystems are an example of complex systems, and I'm interested in complexity. And the other thing about the disorganised surface and just getting that kind of messy gesture down was partly a thing I noticed at art school about painters fetishising their palettes, printers fetishising their plates, and the kind of byproduct of a practice, and kind of getting seduced by the materiality of the medium that you're using. And with paint it's very easy, if you're using watercolour and you see some kind of swirly stuff on your palette, or you're trying to mix a colour and there's a really glorious kind of brush mark on your palette. That kind of chance accident is interesting, but it's only interesting if you can textualise it interestingly. In itself, it's just the material, it's just the product, it's just the material, just the stuff. And also it's a critique of abstract expressionism and the kind of machismo that goes with it, specifically Pollock, but not exclusively. Also, I could look at de Kooning with a kind of hard stare.
Right, okay. Enough said.
And so on. And also when I was at art school, those American painters of the mid and late 20th century were really kind of high in our, were really high in our consciousness, in our awareness. And it was all the white men that were promoted, and now we're seeing great work from all kinds of people who never got any recognition in their lifetime, or who did get a bit of recognition, but it was kind of, they had to play second fiddle to the guys.
The white guys.
Yes.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about that reaction to that set of, macho men in abstract expressionism that you are in some way responding to?
Well, I suppose one way to talk about it is in terms of determinacy and indeterminacy. That if you think about Jackson Pollock, rhythmically flicking, that's a kind of affirmative gesture. And I suppose, I don't know what this has really got to do with gender politics, but I accept that, he's bigger, and most people are bigger than me. You are much taller. We look like an ostrich and a sparrow when we stand. to each other.
That's why you've got the high chair and I've got the low chair.
Well, you are very tall, which is nice. So I suppose it's a kind of man-spreading, isn't it, Pollock? It's a kind of visualisation of man-spreading, but also, you know, how Lee Krasner had to live in his shadow, certainly in terms of exposure, whether she did in her own practice, but...
Do you feel that that's... I guess what I'm trying to get to is that, let's take that rhythm, for instance. I would see that you are beginning with something much more erratic than that, by these splodges that begin your paintings, that are the starting point or starting points, and some of that is you directly putting something on the canvas, but some of that is just accidental from what's gone on another canvas in your studio that ends up on its neighbour.
Yeah, I think that it depends on which decade, seeing as you've kindly said I've been painting for 30 years. So when I first graduated from the Royal College, probably I was much more interested in a single event, and these days I'm probably much more inclined to paint a regular ground that has interference in it and look for stuff in that.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I suppose there are lots of. I suppose you have to keep it moving, don't you? So once you feel like you have a vernacular, you want to expand that in some way. So you have to challenge something about what you've been doing, and because when you throw or when there's a big splash on a canvas, like John Bunker's Instant Loveland logo, that is a figure-ground relationship, and also because in a sense it looks angry, and that's not necessarily what you want to be working on. I don't really know. I suppose that there's also a conservation issue.
Well, your work has to be handled very carefully. In fact, you build your own crates to move it anywhere.
Lots of artists do that.
I know, but I just couldn't be bothered. I'd probably change the way I painted. Maybe not. But you, in that sense then, I mean, the way I see the work, the way that you've got your starting point, and then you're in some way creating systems on the canvas to. I'm being very hesitant with my words here because I don't want to describe it as some sort of fixed thing, like you're trying to make sense of those beginnings or. Create some sort of system with them, because that's got to be your words, but I see things like changes and aversion and contradiction, and I wonder about intention or whether you're trying to discover something along the way.
Well, I suppose the thing is that even if you have a system, it's almost impossible to. It's set up to be fallible, because like we were saying about Berger, you can have structures, but they get breached by natural occurrences, and also it's very difficult to decide whether a regulation applies to something or not. To make that kind of jurisdiction kind of call, and I suppose how I think about it more is organisational, and also deflecting the decision making. I suppose I find being organised quite difficult, and have made a decision at some point in my life that I would like to have an organised existence. And I guess you see that in my painting. It's about trying to impose an organisational strategy on something that isn't that organised, or that is disruptive to me and troubles me in some way. And in so doing, I invent these kind of processes which are complex, and not only are they complex in their own terms, but also they are complex to execute, that it's almost impossible to do it without tripping yourself up. And that happens a lot in the real world, like ecosystems, like political systems, like economies, the migration of wildebeest. All these are complex systems because there's various different factors acting on them that are outside of the system itself. So you set up a kind of like dumb thing for yourself, like circle every green spot in a orange dotted line, and then you're kind of saying to yourself, well, where are the green spots? Is that a spot, or is that more of a kind of slurp?
And is that the tripping up that you're referring to? That you start a system and then it sort of fails on itself, or you?
Well, the tripping up, I suppose, is that is the complexity, that it's got so many kind of by-laws, or you encounter a new scenario, like you've got to the brown lump, so there isn't any kind of precedence for what you do when you get to brown lumps. So you have to then write something new, and or you cut off. If you're not allowed to cross lines, then sooner or later you run out of space.
Yeah, so it sounds like, when you describe it, it sounds like sort of organic computer coding or something like that. Yeah.
Yes. One of my recent paintings is called Cody.
Yes, I saw that.
It's a digital. I was thinking about digital coding. Yeah, I mean, I can't do computer coding. I'm partly the wrong generation, but I just tried to do a coding course quite recently, actually, and fucked up.
Oh dear. Well, I did coding as part of my first degree, and I'm going to just admit here, I was actually really, really good at it. But you're working continually on loops and closed systems, so you're not doing what you're talking about. But I'm glad you brought it back to the sort of real life scenarios, because you have said before that you do see the world through structures and through series of structures. Yeah. So that informs essentially. It's not like you're walking around functioning in the world and then going to your studio and functioning quite differently.
Yeah.
It's a seamless thing in the way that John Berger is, he's living out his life and his work, his own writing pursuits and creative pursuits, the way that they work as part of his belief systems.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also as abstract painters, because you're one too, and I've been to your studio and seen great work. You need to have some relevance beyond abstract painting. Otherwise, at best, it's kind of postmodernism. It's referencing what's gone before. But I mean, for me, you need to have some kind of awareness of the world beyond, and also coming back to the kind of gender politics of it, particularly in Britain, in a way that you don't get in Central Europe, or probably, I don't know, I've never been to Australia, but you certainly don't in the US get so much kind of blind inability to read, to transpose between media and to read abstraction, to think abstractly. It just doesn't seem to be a national trait for some. I don't know. In the UK, people are have quite narrative thinking structures. It seems to me, that's my experience. Anyway, And
I've heard of that spoken about before, actually.
Yeah.
The difference between Europe and the UK
and not just
in those terms.
not just Europe. I think also when you look at Islamic art, for example.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course.
And what I was going to say is that because there's this kind of work that's required from the viewer to just sort of make a leap between stuff they know and stuff they're looking at, and that may or may not be difficult, but quite often it's sort of like, well, you know, ladies decorate kind of thing, and it's seen as not having any content, and it you know, men I know, or non-women,
Yeah.
Other people
I like that, yes.
also complain that abstraction is kind of marginalised and seen as not having content. But aside from that, I do think there is a kind of misogynistic impulse in for women abstract artists, where, you know, it's like even if there is content, it's about her emotions.
Oh, yeah. No,
She's expressing herself. She's an emotional creature.
Oh dear.
Do you do that?
Oh dear. Yeah.
Are you an emotional creature?
I've got some emotionals. That's true. It's true. But that's quite funny. I was going to say something else about that, actually, but I am going to move on. But it is, I love it. It's a hilarious subject. Speaking of subject, when I look at your work, I'm thinking of marks on the wall, body cells. I'm going to give you my list. DNA structures, fabric threads, pathways, power boards inside a computer, landscape, microphysics, road systems, reeds, grasses. I mean, to me, that is the brilliant thing about abstract painting, but also its problem for a lot of people is, what the fuck is it about? How do you talk about it? And there's a certain sort of expansiveness to it, that it opens up all sorts of things that ignite your perception that you bring to the work, but also hopefully, you know, as a result of seeing the work, expand it, but you might not know how it does that, even at any point in time, or you might know 2 weeks later, gosh, that really reminded me of. And
you bring your own experience to it.
Absolutely,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, go on.
And but you know, one of the things that you said, speaking of Instant Loveland, which is an abstract painting platform run by John Bunker and Matt Dennis, in talking about or referring to Kandinsky, you said that, and I'm going to hold you to this because this is a quote, abstract painting as representing a reality that was not observable in an ocular sense, that was nonetheless actually experienced and expressed here in an idiosyncratic visual language. And I guess what I'm sort of, in a very long-winded roundabout way, getting to is this idea of subject and what the painting's about, or what it's not about. For instance, you know, if we look at landscape or figurative, the safety that we have in that is that we are given a signpost of, you know, no matter what, you can easily, or not easily, but it's more accessible to talk about a figure painting or a landscape painting where we know, or an interior world painting where we know what the artist is referring to.
When I was a student, maybe even an A-level student, maybe even, I hope it didn't carry on at art school, I can't quite remember, but people used to say, well, you're not really abstract, because abstract means you have to abstract something, like you have to paint a pot plant and then rework it until you dissolve the structure. But actually, we're talking here about autonomous abstraction, where you paint something that is real but not visual. I mean, like, you know, you said you've done coding, and I know this anyway, that you've done coding, but numbers, maths is abstract thought, and there's no such thing as the number 1.
Yeah.
It's a way of describing something. It's a concept. It's not a thing in the world. But we don't really have any trouble accepting that, or even a word. You know, like word. We know what it is, and that's been written about a lot in by semioticians. The sense of an embodied concept, but somehow when you try and describe it in brightly coloured oil paint that is glossy and slick and smelly, and slightly annoying and slightly toxic, but very enjoyable. It has to be some kind of hedonism. It can't be some kind of. There can't be any kind of cerebral intensity to it. It's which I just think is crap.
Yeah. Okay. Good. But
is that what you're asking? Did I go? Is that your point? No.
Well, I think the point is to just stay on point and go off point and start somewhere and end up somewhere else, isn't it?
Okay.
Much like a painting, but
maybe your paintings.
Well, what about your painting then? Are you? Is there intention? Are you looking to discover something?
Yes, you already asked that, and I didn't answer. I want to see something that I won't see unless I paint it, and I want to be. There's got to be a reason for bringing another painting into the world. So, I have to contribute something to my own knowledge, or ideally, to my own knowledge, but hopefully to a wider kind of body of knowledge that, other people will also go, well, I didn't know, I've never seen anything like that, but I can still see how it got to be. Because if you can't see how it got to be, then it is just a pattern or a surface. Am I trying to discover something? Yeah, I'm trying to see something new. And I suppose what I don't expect to really discover is, any dramatic revelations about painting per se, but I suppose I want to see it used in connections made that haven't been made before, maybe at least by me.
What do you mean by that? I don't want to. It's not about making a discovery in terms of painting.
Well, people always say everything's been done, which is a very lazy thing to say, and obviously bullshit, because we keep seeing all kinds of new things in. It's like saying all maths has been done, or science has been discovered, or something.
People have said that. They've actually turned out to be wrong.
Yes.
But yeah.
But people still have questions, so.
Yeah.
So, but I suppose what you're looking for is incremental. Tiny little discovery is enough. Just the tiniest discovery. You don't want to have an earth-shattering thing that is. Firstly, there's no reason to expect it, and secondly, if you did have something that was so radical, such a massive shift from what you've known before, then you probably wouldn't be able to read it. It would be arbitrary.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So is the discovery within the work itself then?
Yes. I mean, I get a lot of satisfaction from seeing my kind of thinking processes reiterated in other fields. For example, one of my mum's, I've said this loads because it happened 20 years ago, but one of my mum's associates, colleagues friends, I don't know, she took them along to an exhibition I had in London, and they said, "Oh, these are about organisational behaviour. I get these." Of course, I know
Brilliant.
at that time certainly I knew nothing about organisational behaviour, but I really liked that kind of because they are about organisation and they are about behaviour, but not necessarily about institutions.
Yeah. That is really satisfying. I remember a story, Bridget Riley talking about that with a particular curve that she'd done, and somebody came in who was a scientist, I don't know what sort of scientist, probably physics, was working on trying to determine a particular curve, and it had taken him months and months, and there she was. Then he walked in and saw it in her studio in a painting. So that'd be pretty marvellous. I'd feel pleased about that.
Well, a lot of the language we use is very similar to, the language of autonomous abstraction is very similar to the language of physics or maths, the concerns, the terms. And I think there is a lot of potential for collaboration, and a lot of the reading I do is around those subjects rather than around art theory or artists, trying to sound cleverer than we really are.
Of course we're clever. Now come on.
We're as clever as we are.
But let's come back to the painting just to round up, because we're going to finish in a minute. But I was interested as well in terms of the actual paint that's on the surface, and we haven't talked at all about colour, and I don't even know what there is to say about colour, except thank goodness there's lots of it, and very confident colour in your work, which I love. But in the book, there's a point where Odile says, and she's talking to her son, "Are we, Christian, a mother and child flying in the sky?" At that moment, I was 29, Michelle was 37. If I'd been told as a child what the life of an adult is like, I wouldn't have believed it. I'd never have believed it could be so unfinished. I mean, I guess like an art practice, otherwise you would stop painting. But I was thinking about that groundedness of Burge's writing and the flightiness that is also referred to. In fact, Odile's father says, you'll never make a teacher because you're too up in the air, and she is constantly referring to this airiness through the story. But coming to your painting...
Wasn't the inference that some of it's written posthumously? I mean, that's how I was reading it. Like I said, I reread it yesterday, so it's 10 years apart. When she talks about being in the sky and giving instructions to both her children, she's not actually with them. It's either in her head or it's posthumous.
That's true.
Like she's somehow died in the future and is, as adults, this is the teachings that she gave them that she...
Yeah, that's very true. And there is the coming together of different times and different experiences in her life that are brought together in the book, and one really hideous one about some incident with her partner, and mixing that up with her and her dad grafting the fruit trees. Oh God, that was hideous. But let's not... Why did we go there? I went there, sorry.
Yeah.
But let's come back to your work. So I was thinking of that about just in terms of weightiness and airiness and the idea of finished and unfinished. And I wanted to ask you about do you think of your paintings in these terms? Because for me, the broken lines, the ideas about weight and pushing and heaviness and lightness, again in terms of weight. Do you want to say a bit about that? I mean, the paint itself has a certain weight to it because it's so thick.
Yes, and if you make it, and also it's slow drying because it's oil paint, so if you make it big enough, it will just drop off the canvas. And even if you get quite a big crust with it on the floor, you lift it up and it still drops off.
Yeah.
So, it's the same when you're casting large quantities or large volumes of whatever material, it will sooner or later not go off. But the whole point about systems, not the whole point, but one of the points about systems is that I've always felt kind of formally redundant, not able to really kind of have the sensitivity of whether a line is the right weight, the right colour, and whether it's the right combination, because it's all so relative. So there are so many decisions to be made that I'm like a rabbit in the headlights and I can't make any decision. So by having a system, you kind of still are doing that, but it's regulated, and you make one decision and then that's that, and you just do the painting, and you are continually making decisions, but you in your mind you're not, and then the painting is kind of finished when the system's done. So if I have to join all the black dots to orange circles around green splashes, when they've all connected, then the system's done, and what invariably happens is there's more of one than the other, so you have to come up with a kind of algorithm to make that work, or a set of sub-clauses, that's the rule, and this is the rule that is ancillary to that major rule.
Yeah.
Which is a bit like programming, as I understand it.
Yeah, but then how are you choosing the colours then, if everything else is so systemised?
Yeah, well, everything is a system in a way. Figurative painting is a system. It's a system for seeing and representing and analysing the vision, the scene, and schematising it into a two-dimensional surface. And I suppose one of the things I think about is how obtrusive, how contrasting I want the colour relationship to be, what it's going to be like in volume and what it's going to be like in isolation. So where you have a tiny little mark in a big field, like if you had to put a little bit of blue, this is green screen, and
Who knows?
We can see it's green screen.
Who knows what's going on there?
Yeah, but those kinds of relationships, and then it relates to what's gone before. So it changes the dynamic, the pre-existing dynamic, when you introduce another colour. But it's not just the colour; it's also the weight and the line, and the mass that it's going to make. And some of that's you can't know; it's indeterminate, so it comes out of the system. But those kinds of things do influence how you implement the system. You can't help but spot it as you're painting, and you think, well, if I go right around the blob, then you're going to end up with a massive sea of green over there. But if I go left, then there'll be much less. Now, which is the better kind of visual, intuitive decision to make?
So, over what time are these produced? Because if this was me doing your paintings, I would never do them as well as you, obviously, but I would forget my system halfway through and do another system.
Yeah, especially like at the moment, as you know, I've been spending January a lot at my laptop doing a lot of writing, and if you start a painting and then you spend a fortnight writing about someone else's work and then go back to your painting, you've completely forgotten, and that's part. But even if you're doing it every day, it kind of evolves. But then that happens in real life too, like customs, practice evolves, culture changes, the law changes, and also it changes regionally as well. So you have a county court up in the northeast that tends to make rulings in this kind of area of decision making, and then somewhere down in Kent or in a big city in Manchester where the rulings tend to be much more kind of victim centred, for example.
I see. Yeah.
And if you have to do a signature Do you remember when you used to have to sign check after check after check, and
in the olden days?
Yeah, in the olden days, and your signature would gradually change. You think, or language changes with use. So it's just like life.
Yeah, it is just like life. Speaking of life or other people's lives, I'm just interested if there are any other particular artists that you feel are important to your practice, or that you've, I mean, not so much the artists from, the first artist that made a big impact on you or anything like that, but I mean just somebody who you might return to, or somebody who surprised you recently. I know we both went to the Cézanne exhibition separately, but that was pretty amazing.
Yes, and I wasn't expecting to enjoy that so much as I did. A massive fan of Vermeer, and have been since I was, a student at the Royal College.
What is it about his work?
Well, partly because there's so few of them. He wasn't experienced, and he wasn't professional. But the real thing that interests me about it is the detachment between artist and image. That there's this kind of objectivity from using a camera obscura, from painting upside down, and painting in that kind of. There's nothing holistic about it at all. There's no. Well, if there is gesture there, it's tiny gesture. But equally, I really like Franz Haus because there's so much gesture, and you completely suspend disbelief. It's impossible to look at a Franz Haus without seeing these really kind of physical, formal representations of people. They look so vivid. And then when you go up to the surface, there's nothing there. There's just a few kind of flourishes and brush marks.
Well, I will find some references with your approval, and I'll put them on the Art Fictions podcast Instagram. So you do a lot of writing, and I know that you do critical writing, you write essays, you work on the Terps painting course, but where can we see your work coming up? You've got an exhibition coming up at Thameside, right?
Oh, yes. I'm curating an exhibition with Peter Lamb, which opens in 3 weeks.
Excellent.
3 weeks today at Thameside.
What's that, the 22nd?
22nd, yes.
Yeah.
And do you want to know who's in it?
I'm not in it. That's all I know.
Right.
And you're in it, and Peter Lamb's in it, right?
Yeah.
But where else can we see your work coming up?
Well, maybe I shouldn't say the speculative ones, but I'm definitely showing in working with Andrew Bick and Jonathan Parsons on an exhibition that's in Zers, SK Zers Stiftung Konzeptuelle Kunst in Zers in northern Germany. That's very much Andrew's connection, but my role seems to be mainly to do with the publication, I think, but I'll be showing there.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll put all that in the podcast notes and also on the Instagram. And I think at this point I'm going to say thank you, listeners, and thank you, Katie Pratt, for being on Art Fictions.
Thanks for inviting me, Jillian. And thanks, Andy.
Absolutely. So if you want to get in touch with any insights, questions, responses to today's program, please feel welcome to email me at artfictionspodcast@gmail.com. You can hear this Art Fictions program all over again, if you like, on Cubitt Community Radio via cubittartists.org.uk, and also in edited podcast form from next week on Spotify, Apple, Audible, and all other major podcast platforms, along with the back catalogue of previous episodes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Andy Armishar's brilliant Cubitt Community Radio for making this recording possible. Have a great week.